Welcome back to another Box Score Geek show. I'm your host, Dre Alvarez. You can find me on the Twitter as Nerd Numbers. With me, as always, is our producer, the voice of God, Brian Foster, who you can find on Twitter as Box Score Brian. Give a shout out real quick, Brian, with a 50-50 chance you'll be muted or not. So keep it short regardless.
No, I'm not muted, but it is very short.
Thanks for that. All right. So, as always, as I keep mentioning, I love the regular season for NBA because I don't have to worry about finding stories. In the off season, we kind of have to find things to talk about, think about things ahead of time. If Brian and I aren't on it Monday, by the time Wednesday rolls around, the shows end up a little clunkier. But, regular season, even during a holiday week, there's just tons of news, tons of stuff to talk about. Also, we're coming out a day early because obviously Thursday is Christmas. There is going to be some NBA going on, but we figured, we'd release Christmas Eve for you. So if you want to listen to your normal podcast, you'd get one in before the year. And Brian and I have various holiday stuff, so this works in our schedule. All right, so what we're going to be talking this week is Kobe Bryant, Josh Smith, and sports journalism. 2 of 3 are bad shooters, and the third one I'm not too high on either. So we'll get to that. Every week I do a poll. So last week, I don't think I gave you the link, but I think it's not too hard for you to get, Brian. But the poll I gave was about Adrian Wojnarowski, based on the great work that Kevin Draper did that basically said, hey, Adrian Wojnarowski as a journalist kind of blurs the line in terms of ethics, preferential treatment, how he gets his stories, making up news when he can't get it, which, by the way, is giving me pause given the recent Josh Smith, which we'll talk about in a second. But the recent Josh Smith news, Wojnarowski is pushing the Houston Rockets as a front runner. And this could be actual news, or it could be the fact that, if Wojnarowski has an in with Josh Smith's agent, who I don't know off the top of my head, it's possible he's pushing for that team because that's who Josh Smith and his agent want. So we'll have to see about that. But sadly, last week, you just weren't as outraged as I was when it came to Josh Smith. Or not Josh Smith. You'll be just as outraged. Josh Smith will be this week's poll. Don't worry, and I'm sure you guys will side on that. But 49-33 in terms of saying no, you didn't think Wojnarowski's methods were acceptable. 33 of you did say you didn't have a problem with it, and a few people in the comments did say, what's the big deal? So not quite as outraged as I was hoping. Maybe my medium for using my completely biased show to impact your thoughts has failed. But at least you sided with, obviously, the tilt I was going for. And that said, though, Wojnarowski, and just kind of in general, I had some discussions with Dave Barry this week, kind of about criticizing mainstream media, mainstream stat analysis. And what I'll say on that is that I'm not against the idea that we recognize the audience for certain things or the people, what they're trying to produce isn't necessarily what consumers like us, the advanced stats people, are looking for. So basically, we might be really hard on, say, a person like Zach Lowe, Henry Abbott, Nate Silver, and it's fine to actually say, just be aware, their audience isn't an advanced stats person. Their audience isn't someone who knows the numbers really well. That said, that doesn't relieve them from criticism. So I have no problem criticizing a lot of sports pieces for statistical flaws or logical flaws. And in fact, one of the problems I'll have in reading a lot of sports journalism, you can call it that, is that it's really stream of conscious. It's not really methodical, thought out stats that can be tested or well-groomed research that we can actually look at. It tends to be very stream of conscious. The person has a narrative to tell that they want to tell. And so, for instance, I was looking at a piece about Kobe Bryant and this person where they would put them in their top 5. I'm not going to link the piece. I didn't think it was that good. But this person in the same paragraph said they would take Bill Russell as their number 1 center because they liked winners. That was their logic. In the same paragraph, they then decided to take Wilt Chamberlain over Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, as you might recall, has 5 titles, has the most MVPs. So it's kind of, was on one of the winningest teams ever in the 80s dynasty of the Lakers. So it's this person, their exact logic fell apart in less than the span of a paragraph. And I notice this a lot. When you read a lot of sports journalism, the reason it falls apart when we're looking at it from a statistical mindset is that they're looking for a narrative. When someone watches the game and then has a story to write, as a reporter, their goal is to get something out quickly with a story that's compelling. So, for instance, Zach Lowe or Kelly Dwyer, I forget which. I think it's Kelly Dwyer. But Kelly Dwyer had a piece about Kobe Bryant and the day he missed his the first shot at passing Michael Jordan's record for third on the all-time scoring list. And the story he told is that Kobe Bryant was actually restrained, and he could have just been Chuck Happy and passed the record, but he was restrained, and by being restrained, he helped the Lakers win. Fantastic narrative, right? Well, if you look at that game, Kobe Bryant still took over 20 shots and was just a chucker, and the game went to overtime. So the reality of the matter is, and oh, another thing in that game is it was a really, really stupid shot from Nick Young that got the win. So the reality of that story is Kobe Bryant didn't play very well. The Lakers lucked into a win against the Spurs. Kobe Bryant was just as bad as he's been all season, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a second. That narrative isn't as fun as Kobe Bryant selflessly decides to pass on getting the scoring record to help his team win. Which, of course, by the way, we'll notice the narrative now is completely flipped. Yahoo, in particular, Kelly Dwyer, are completely against Kobe. That's our next segment. And so that's the problem, is that when your goal is fast news and narrative and it's not introspective stats, you're just always going to be at odds. And I went on this kind of tirade on Twitter last night about that, where I said, I'm a big fan of advanced, you can call it advanced stats. I don't care what you want to call it. I want to see more smart statistical analysis applied to sports. You can call that the Moneyball era. You can call that the advanced stats movement. Although a lot of the people, and I think the APBR, I always mess with the acronym, I'm not too thrilled with their work, to be candid. But when you actually examine sports media, you kind of just go, that's not going to happen. Because the goals are so divergent. We're never going to see people sit down and go, you know what, if I want to give you really good analysis, it's going to take several hours of me looking through numbers, maybe rewatching the game, maybe, looking at the play-by-play, maybe comparing these numbers to other people, maybe seeing, one of the things you could do, right, is let's say Kobe Bryant shoots 54% from the field for the night. Well, you could say, okay, it doesn't seem like a great game, but the defense is really good. And normally Kobe shoots well from here. And he was taking, you could do all this in-depth stuff, but that would take a lot of time, a lot of introspection. And the reality is your audience really wouldn't care. A few people that responded to me, like one of the people they brought up was Henry Abbott. And I'm actually a fan of Henry Abbott's, but I said something last week, and Henry Abbott's going to fall in this category. I apologize. I said, just be candid. The most stats savvy reporters would fall in the bottom half of like a stats major at a college. The most stats savvy reporters don't know stats that well. I'm sorry. You can even see, flaws in their statistical arguments regularly. And there's a piece from Henry Abbott. I'll debate. We'll see if I'm feeling the Christmas spirit by the time this goes up, that I may or may not put in the notes, where he talks about how he's not the biggest fan of stats and how he views it as like a dishwasher or just a tool, and he didn't care that much, and his major wasn't in that. And we see that with a lot of top writers. The impetus for sports journalism and sports reporting is people that are really good at conveying stories in a well-written fashion. And there's less impetus on people who are good at the numbers. And let's be candid, people who are really good at numbers and conveying that information can make a heck of a lot more money than writing about sports. And, even those of us that do it, I'm not even going to say we're good at writing. We've had some terrible flaws in the writing quality at the site. And, thank goodness you've held with us over the years, as we've really tried to improve that for some of us. But, that said, it's just the matter that you're not going to see people that are just aces at the numbers, who are aces at explaining things, usually writing about sports. And that means what you're going to find are people who are really good at crafting narratives and kind of finding the stats they need. And even Henry Abbott, one of my favorite pieces from him is on Kobe's clutch performance. Two things: nobody seemed to notice. Nobody seemed to care. He's written about Kobe clutch multiple times, and he still gets in arguments with people about it. And second, the stats for that weren't that complicated. The stats for that were as simple as watching the last 5 minutes of the game, watching the last 30 seconds and seeing if Kobe put up a shot and if it hit or miss. And, that was essentially counting to 50. And with such simple stats, no one cared. No one really cared about that level of journalism or in depth. So I've just kind of over the last year between 538, between BPM at Basketball Reference, between RPM at ESPN, I've just kind of come to the realization that we're not going to see a change in sports media to be a more advanced stats tilt. No matter how many people are saying Moneyball and the advanced stats revolution and this and this and this, I'm just not seeing it. And that's not a problem. It's because the product being produced by places like ESPN or Yahoo is to feed most people that don't care about the stats. They want a quick narrative. They want it quick. The Adrian Wojnarowski thing. That's what people want. They want to go on Twitter and beat a trade rumor by 5 minutes, right? Because we're going to hear that information, right? The Boston Celtics are going to say, we traded Rajon Rondo for so and so and so and so. We're not going to miss that, but we want to find it 5 minutes early and speculate. And that's fun, but the candid reality is we're not going to see the mainstream sports media really get that much more stat savvy. At least I don't buy it. Merry Christmas, bah humbug, I guess. So with that in mind, let's actually talk about a story on sports media, Kobe Bryant. And apologies, Brian. Normally I let you get the last word if you want it. So do you want to stay away from that, or do you want to actually chime in?
No, I'll jump in, Dre. In fact, I've got the poll up right now. I'm going to switch my vote from Waj over to LeBron in your honor. I'm going to give him the 50th vote right here on air. So
Awesome.
I'll give you a quick devil's advocate, which is sort of.
By the way, just to be a devil's
Yes.
advocate to the devil's advocate, you're aware that the devil's advocate was actually started like in the Vatican. It was supposed to be the person voicing the minority opinion. So when people say, I'm going to play devil's advocate, and they go for the mainstream opinion, they're not technically being the devil's advocate. Now, with that said, go, floor is to you, sir.
The mainstream internet stat nerd opinion, maybe. But
What I'm saying is if you're going to say devil's advocate to what I just said, I'm clearly in the minority here. I'm clearly speaking against the grain. So with that said, though, go ahead.
well, within your framework of wanting good analysis, I think that if you have everything in your mind, sort of what you just said the past few minutes, when you're reading all this stuff on Twitter, I can kind of work through it, right? I'm like, okay, well, maybe this isn't real journalism, whatever that is nowadays. Maybe he doesn't play everyone the same way. He plays favorites. But the material's accurate, and it is what it is. So if you're okay kind of accepting the pluses and minuses of his reporting and understand what it is, then I can kind of be okay with it.
Well,
Now,
the thing that when you said accurate, the thing to notice, and that was one of the things Kevin Draper brought up about LeBron James, for instance, and even now, like I said with Josh Smith, is that he was accurate. Like that's the problem. We have false positives and false negatives, which is he was accurate when he had the information correct, but when he didn't have the information, he was essentially fine to either make it up or shill for people that he was trying to help. So that's where, to me, that's where he falls apart. It's like if all he did was use the favorable sources he had to accurately report, fine. But the problem, right, is he can't then say, hey, I don't have a source for LeBron James, so we're just not going to report on LeBron James. Of course, Yahoo's like, no, you're kidding me. You have
yeah.
to be spinning rumors about where LeBron James is ending up.
Yeah, and I'm about to go against all that right now too, but it's yeah, and that's the thing is I don't think we're at the point now where most people can comfortably say what I just said, that they are okay with going through that, because I guess what I do when I'm looking for news is I go to Twitter, I read all kinds of different guys there, I go to Reddit, whatever, I go to all these, yeah, and I kind of piece together a composite of what everyone's saying and try to figure it out. And but your point is that, well, each person individually should be okay, right? And that should be a lot more honest. So, yeah, overall, it's probably bad.
Well, I was
But
going to say that this was less against Wojnarowski because even if you take out the cynicism about spinning false stories, all I'm saying is that you're not going to see the sports media suddenly change to say, "Hey, we're going to give you accurate stats with well thought out analysis." In part because they don't know how to do it. Like that's not a dig against them, right? Like I don't, I take my car to a mechanic. I'm not really good with my car. I now have an electric car, so I know even less about how to fix that. So, I don't know what to do there. You don't hold that against me. Now, it's possible if I have a job where I drive, you might start saying, well, maybe you should know a little bit more about cars. But even then I'd go, well, my job is to drive the car. It's not to maintain it. And it's the same with sports where it's like they have to talk about some of the stats but clearly the final product they're expected to give out is not supposed to be, here is something that would pass a stats 200 course in terms of stats rigor, and here is something that, doesn't, and it is very straightforward. One of my favorite shows is Sports Night. There's actually a clip I'm going to have to grab that we're going to have to start using on the show where he's like, I know sports is really complicated, but this one's pretty self-explanatory. I want to start using that for some of the things I say. But he actually has an episode where he has writer's block, and he's like, "What do you got?" And he tries to read about a game, and he's like, "These two teams played a game. This team scored 3 goals. This other team scored 2 goals, right?" And then we look at it, and it falls flat, right? We expect quick information that's mostly accurate with a narrative behind it with less rigor on the narrative, and that's just never gonna jive with having in-depth thought out stats. One of the things Devin and I have talked about, by the way, thanks for letting me take over the conversation again, Brian, but one of the things Devin and I have talked about is we've had article ideas where we do all of this research and the end result is like a 2-line answer that's very boring and unsatisfying, and we don't even turn it into a post because no one cares if we're just like, yeah, this player wasn't good.
Yeah, and to add to that a little, I did read the Kevin Draper piece after we taped the show last week, and of course it was amazing. Just reading it, you could tell, to use that word rigor, just how rigorous it was. You could tell he must have spent months researching this, talking to people, and yeah, that's not very practical in this day and age, right? He got a great story published that we love, but was it proportional to sort of the amount of work that he put into it? Probably not. So, yeah, I mean, it's a really large topic about journalism in general, but boy, that was a great piece. I really recommend reading it. And I guess in the end, for me personally, it does show, assuming it was all right, we trust Kevin's writing, I think, here on this show. It doesn't paint Wojnarowski as a very nice person, so he loses points just for being a meanie in my book.
But again,
in the Christmas spirit, right?
Yeah, and he's a Grinch, I guess. But let's talk Kobe because it's the same thing here. Where I was also talking with Dave about this, and one of the notes I brought up, I use sports as an example. So I've talked with EJ Fisher about gender before, and one of the things that gets really, really hard to divorce is people's action from their environment. Because we'll notice gender differences between men and women, but we'll also notice that there's basically an infrastructure in place that rewards certain behavior in men, punishes it in women. So we're more likely to see men be more outspoken and loud. I actually said this on Twitter. I was listening to Cracked podcast. By the way, someone in the comments was like, really a Cracked article. I love Cracked. I will say there are some writers on Cracked that I'm like, wow, I really don't respect you at all, but there are some really fantastic writers on Crack, some really fun pieces. I love their podcast. And so the recent podcast, they were talking actually about women's issues. And what was really odd to me is it was 2 male hosts and a female. And the 2 male hosts were talking over the female about women's issues. And I noticed, I was like, well, it's acceptable, right? Like it's acceptable as a guy to just jump into the conversation, say everything. It's less acceptable to hop in if you're a female. By the way, I'm just, whatever. We'll see what people say in the comments about that. But so let's tie this back to sports. Like Kobe Bryant and sports reporting, right? The environment, if you're a sports reporter, is get me news quickly, get me scoops, get me good narratives. You get me those 3 things, you're successful in this business. If I'm someone, I'm trying to remember, what was that movie with it was like 50-50 with Seth Rogen and Robin getting cancer. Good movie. And so there's a part where he's like working for NPR essentially, and he's got this really in-depth piece he's trying to make, and the joke is like how much work he's putting into this piece that clearly his boss doesn't care about. And it's the same thing here, right? If I'm in sports journalism and I say, hey, I'm going to spend 2 months researching the Warriors' 3-point shooting efficiency so I can get you one 500-word piece, the person's just going to look at me and go, you're useless. Just tell me why David Lee is bad at defense in 1,000 words by tomorrow. So, with that in mind, we have Kobe Bryant, and the narrative is just absolutely flipped on him. And the reason I bring him up, comparing him to that, is like the environment a sports reporter is in to produce that kind of stuff to essentially be this is going to be fun, a high usage, low efficiency reporter. Kobe Bryant has kind of been that his whole career. His shooting efficiency isn't terrible, but at around 55%, it's not been stellar. He's been a high usage player his whole career, and he has been rewarded for it. And just recently, I noticed Kelly Dwyer wrote a piece recently that says Kobe Bryant has to stop. And basically, like I said, this is a person who just a few weeks ago was congratulated, was patting Kobe Bryant on the back for holding back to get a win, and now saying Kobe Bryant is shooting his teams out of games. And what I will say is, Kobe Bryant is not good. He is, I think, the worst player on the Lakers. He's one of the worst players in the league right now. But what I'll say is he's doing the same stuff he's done before. And in fact, he's actually been bad before. One of my pieces that I linked to you, Brian, was on Kobe Bryant and Shaq's rings. And what I kind of noted is that if you look at the regular season for Kobe and Shaq, the narrative that we're used to basically, Shaq was this behemoth and Kobe was this young upstart who was getting better and better and better. Well, Shaq declined. Totally fits up in the regular season. But if we look at the playoffs, basically Kobe Bryant in the Shaq Kobe three-peat was only really good one of those seasons. And in fact, he was terrible the very first ring they got where Shaq was just completely dominant. So we've seen Kobe be bad before. And in fact, when the Lakers won their last title against the Celtics, Kobe almost shot them out of the game. It was, if people recall, it was a really, really close game. And Kobe shot something horrendous. I gave you the box score, Brian, but I get to use your name. But Kobe ended up shooting something like 6 for 24. He did actually rebound really well in that game, which was amazing. But he was 6 for 24 with 2 assists and 4 turnovers. He was just horrendous on offense. So we've seen Kobe's bad habits hurt the Lakers before. The major difference we have now is that Kobe's teammates are horrible right now. We were really high on Jordan Hill, but he seems to not be playing well. The only player the Lakers have that's getting minutes and playing well right now is Ed Davis, and that's not good. And, Kobe Bryant's also old. One of the things I tweeted this out earlier this week. It's the last bullet point I have, Brian, but I actually going to bring it forward. Is I tweeted about CM Punk because, his interview came out recently on the Cabana podcast. It was great stuff. And one of the things that was really interesting to me about that is that CM Punk said he's never had a WrestleMania main event, which was nuts. And when I looked over the stats, what I discovered is that in the modern era, which is, wrestlers who have wrestled since the advent of WrestleMania, only 4 WWE wrestlers have held the title for over a year. Now, I understand, by the way, kind of the absurdity of that. Wrestling is scripted, but let's kind of view this as like Miss America. Like the WWE has assigned the Miss America award to a wrestler, and CM Punk is one of the Miss Americas of professional wrestling. He is the only one that never had a WrestleMania main event. And the reason for this, by the way, is that in his heyday, when he was holding the title, The Rock wanted to come back and wrestle. And they basically said, The Rock is a big draw. We're going to give The Rock the WrestleMania main events. The Rock wrestled John Cena 2 back-to-back WWE main events in WrestleMania. CM Punk didn't get a main event. People argue his match against The Undertaker should have been the main event. That said, it wasn't. But we can kind of view this as sports. We can kind of view this as Kobe, which is to say, older athletes are just not as good as younger athletes. And the only place where age isn't really a detriment to you is wrestling, where it's scripted. All of the older players, Shaquille O'Neal, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar, we've seen them decline. Not Magic Johnson. Magic Johnson played really well as a power forward, not up to his same standards, but of course he was a little different. Michael Jordan was not, even if you look at Michael Jordan's very last season with the Bulls, he was not a great player. He was an okay player. And if you look at him on the Wizards, he was downright terrible. Age matters in the NBA. So you have Kobe doing the same stuff he's been doing his whole career on a much, much worse team than he's ever been on, being much, much older than he's ever been. And now we're turning against him and saying he's hurting the team. And basically, my kind of thought is that's just false expectations on our part. One of the things I've been talking about, I was guilty of this kind of, is people seemed higher on Kobe to start the season than Dwayne Wade, which seems ludicrous. Dwayne Wade played really well last season, but he was definitely breaking down. Kobe Bryant, though, was out all of last season and is now a year older. So this idea that Kobe Bryant was going to be able to come back and play close to, 28-year-old Kobe as opposed to mid-30s Kobe was just absolutely ridiculous. So all these stories I'm starting to see where people are turning against Kobe, what annoys me about him is like, you were completely okay with this his entire career. And the reason now that you're upset with him essentially boils down to you're old and you have a bad team. And those are both out of Kobe's control, right? It's not his fault he got old. It's not his fault the Lakers offered him $25 million. That's another interesting kind of wrinkle in this story is if we look at the Lakers, they got Chris Paul, they got Chris Paul, the league prevented them from getting Chris Paul. They got Dwight Howard and Steve Nash. Dwight Howard was injured that season and didn't want to come back. That was the front office's fault, by the way. If the front office had offered Dwight the contract, said they were going to build the team around him, and then told Kobe to work within that framework, maybe Kobe would be contributing on a different team. Now, I don't fault Kobe for taking the money and the leadership on the team, but I'm saying the Lakers front office built a bad team around Kobe. Some of it wasn't their fault. Some of it was bad luck with Steve Nash getting injured, with the Chris Paul trade getting vetoed. Some of it was their fault in giving Kobe the money. And one thing I'll actually say, this is remarkable because I'm not a huge fan of being really happy with players for off the court stuff in terms of rewarding them. But this year I'll actually give Kobe, by the end of the year, I might give him some award. I linked an article to you, Brian. But basically, he says, I'm not falling for the owner's brilliant negotiation ploy. And Kobe Bryant basically says, we have this stupid system set up where we view it as just like this great thing that Tim Duncan and Dirk Nowitzki take pay cuts so their teams can remain competitive. And it's such a cheap tactic for the owners to like have the players be viewed as selfish if they take the money and unselfish if they give it up. And, who benefits, right? Dirk Nowitzki gave up the money. Who ended up benefiting? It was like Monte Ellis and Chandler Parsons. Dirk Nowitzki didn't benefit, or a billionaire. Mark Cuban benefits. There's also another great article up on the ESPN watch called Faux Populism that two of our favorite people, again, has Kevin Draper being quoted and then also has Jonathan Weiler summing up where he's just like, yeah, if we look at this kind of just myth that the mainstream media is giving about yelling at players for being overpaid, it just doesn't line up when we view that the money that they're saving by being unselfish in quotes is going to billionaire owners. So I actually give it to Kobe. I this is the one season I'm actually defending him, and the reason I'm defending him is like my thought is you're just as overrated as ever. You're chucking just as much as ever. You're old, and I was pretty sure you were going to decline. But the reason people are turning on you is not that they've suddenly gotten wise. It's that they are mad that you're doing the same stuff that they have been applauding you for in a different context than before. And that kind of drives me nuts. So, whew, a lot on Kobe. Anything to add, Brian?
Yeah, I just refer to your comments in the last segment. I mean, I don't think we can expect writers who we say are driven by narratives only, and that's what they're expected to produce, who aren't even consistent within the same paragraph in a piece, to be consistent across several pieces across several years. Not going to happen.
That is an awesome point. And yeah, Kobe's showing it. And that's, to me, that's the reason I'm siding with Kobe here is I'm like, I wanted you guys to agree with me about Kobe being overrated and taking bad shots and being unclutch. You're not on board now, though, for the right reasons. And that may sound petty of me.
We can't win with you, Dre, no matter what. We can't win with you.
It's absolutely, I mean, that's the funny thing. When you look at me and the same kind of tirade I went off on about sports journalism, it's like, my goal is not to win arguments. There's absolutely no way for this not to come out arrogant. So let's just turn into the skid. Let's have fun with the holiday season. I'm really good at stats and numbers. I mean, I've got degrees in it. I've interviewed at very top companies and gotten there. I work candidly with some of the brightest people in the sports business. All of them are basically doing this part-time as hobby. Dave Barry, Ari Caroline, Patrick Minton, Arturo Galletti. These people are all really smart, talented math people that know this. And like I said, the mainstream people, as stats savvy as they are, as much as I love them, they're just not top stats people. I know this stuff relative to other people, and I know like that I can be right about it. That's fine. My goal is not to be right. My goal is to try at times, or was, to try and spread information and kind of improve enlightenment. And we can get into weird arguments about communicating better and better graphics and whatever. That's fine. But that's what I'm saying is like, my goal isn't in the end for people to agree with me about Kobe being a bad player or Allen Iverson being overrated or whatever. It's for them to have enlightenment about how to view the stats. And when that doesn't happen, when someone agrees with you for the wrong reasons, you're just like, oh, wow, that's not what I wanted at all. And I know that makes me, kind of really high maintenance, but, that's how it goes. And that's why I have a show where I complain, once a week, because you can't always get what you want, right?
Well, and to put it the most simply, it's, we always talk, I guess, in the mainstream about someone being better or worse than someone else. But really, it's just one thing, right? It's just a number. So, of course, we're going to argue both sides of the argument depending upon where you are. If you're too far away from that number on one side or the other, we're going to argue both ways, right? So, really, it comes back to this whole statistical magnitude. This has been our theme the last month or two, I guess, with Kevin Love. That's what it's about.
Yeah, it's how you should be looking at the stats, and I'm just not seeing that, right? Like we're going to talk Josh Smith, and
I'm ready.
God, this was the most amazing thing ever. So for those of you, if you've made it this far in the podcast, listening to me rant about Kobe and sports and all this, and you don't know the Josh Smith news, I just please say who you are. I want to meet you because I don't think you exist. So Josh Smith was waived by the Detroit Pistons. By the way, what they're going to do, I believe this according to Larry Kuhn, one of the things you're allowed to do if you waive a player is you're allowed to spread out their salary so that you spread out the cap hit. So they still have to pay him. I think it was 3 or 4 years at 14 million. They still are completely on the hook for that, but they can basically spread that out over I think 5 years instead of three, and so the cap hit's diminished each year. So that's probably what's going to happen. And so one of the things about Josh Smith, I'm going to put this first actually because we were just talking about magnitude. I'm of the opinion that if you are a team in the NBA and your thought right now is, man, let's give Josh Smith a try. You failed. You've already lost. Like that line of thinking right there, you've already failed because this is someone who is 30 years old, who is years and years and years away from being a really, really good player. Now, he has been above average in the past, but what I should stress, one of the terms we can talk is regression to the mean. And this is a really, really hard thing to detect in sports. So in 2008, Josh Smith was just amazing. And one of the reasons he was amazing, I think, was he stopped taking such bad long shots. He actually shot better. He's always been pretty good at rebounding. Someone to me pointed out that he's pretty good at passing, which is true. Like his assist to turnover ratio has traditionally been good. It's actually been really, really good this season in Detroit, which is kind of odd. So I don't expect that to hold up at 7.1 assists per 48. But essentially, he does have some good qualities. But if we look at the overall Josh Smith, he's just at best been an average player. He had one season, actually it was 2010, sorry. 2010, he played really, really well. My dog wants you to, be on his side about that. So in 2010, he played at star level, and then he just dropped back to being about an average player the next couple of years. And then since then has just declined into the horrendous player he is now. So regression to the mean is when there's an outlier. Someone has a really, really good season, really, really bad season, and you believe that the next season they're going to be more close to their average. These are hard to detect because with, say, for instance, young players that improve like Kevin Durant, you could go, this is an outlier season, he's probably going to go down next season, or you could say this is an outlier season, he's probably boosted. But with the benefit of hindsight, with years and years of hindsight, it's fair to say that 2010 was really an outlier season, and Josh Smith regressed to the mean and has since gotten much, much worse. And so if you're on the fan of let's give Josh Smith a try, the reason I'm upset is it's going, this is a risky player. And when we were talking magnitude, one of the things I've seen people argue about is his defense. And one of the reasons this drives me nuts, I wrote a piece on this about, I called it defending defenses. People will use this statement all the time. It drives me, just absolutely batty. They say, defense is 50% of the game. Fine. But the defense you're talking about, when you say Josh Smith is able to hamper the opponent's shot, that is not 50% of the game. That is not even 50% of Josh Smith's game. So even if you think he's really, really good at that, Josh Smith this season is currently like, not only is he below average, he is currently essentially spotting the opponent 3.2 points a game if you were to play the full game. And a lot of that has to do with his really, really poor shot selection. His effective field goal percentage this season is the worst it's been of his career. His true shooting is absolutely horrendous. He's chucking up a ton of shots. He's taking over 20 field goals per 48 minutes. His turnovers are high. I mean, his assists are high too, but his turnovers are high. And his personal fouls, they finally started creeping up. So maybe even if he is good at defense, he might be slowing down.
Dre, I think I read that he may have been on pace to actually break some kind of NBA record for a season low shooting percentage for some minimum number of shots. Is that true?
I forgot to add that tweet. Do you happen to have that? But yes, basically, no. I believe it is. If you look for, depending on how fast you are, if you go to Basketball Reference, I'll include this in the links regardless. But if you go to the Play Index Plus thing and look for a player season, if you look for players that take over 14 shots a game and have a true shooting percentage below 42%, the only player that currently shows up is Josh Smith for this season. And so if he happens to just not get to play for another team for the rest of the season, he'll hold that distinction of being the only player to do that. Of course, it's only 28 games in, so he's fully possible to, pull himself out of that nosedive. But yes, he is just playing horrendously this season. And so, but as I mentioned with the defense, right? People are looking at all this stuff that Josh Smith does well. They're saying his assists are good, his defense might be good. Like I said, I'm a little trepidatious on that. But what you're ignoring is, as a whole, Josh Smith is a really, really bad player, and he has been declining over the last several years. So what you've got is you've got this old player who is years removed from being a good player. Why would you want to take a risk on that? And one of the things I'll notice, so we have years of data about looking at player performance year to year. And basically what we notice is a player's performance the previous year compared to the next year, highly predictive. And Kevin Draper actually has a good piece. It's called Why Is It Too Hard to Accept You Suck? I think is what it's called. I'll link that as well. Where he basically points, if you look at how good a team was last year versus how good they are this year, it's incredibly predictive. But one thing about, that information, right, is we have years and years of data that says player performance tends to be pretty predictive of future player performance. The other thing we have is we say basically coaches don't really seem to impact player performance. We talked a little last week about good defensive schemes, but the other thing to note is, just excluding a few coaches, most coaches don't really impact player performance. So if your thought is all I have to do is coach Josh Smith the right way, the logic you're going is this area where basically we don't tend to see that happen, versus the other is just, why don't you just go for another player? Why don't you just look for undrafted players who are really good in college, look for players who are playing well in the EuroLeague. If you're an advanced stats team and you're looking at Josh Smith and you tell me you don't have other players that might have high upside that you can give a chance to, I just don't have a lot of faith in you. So that's kind of my problem with Josh Smith. And the one thing I'll say about Detroit that makes this incredible, one of the very, very first pieces Patrick wrote was about the sunk cost fallacy. He called it NBA and managers need to learn how to quit. And so the sunk cost fallacy kind of works like this. You make a poor decision. So you spend $100 million on a bad player like Alex Rodriguez or something. Now, as you're going on, you realize this was a poor decision. Your best course of action is probably just to stop. You've already sunk a bunch of money into this, but the more money you sink into this decision, it's just going to be bad. So it's best to just cut your losses and move on. But people will basically go, no, I need to recoup my losses, right? I've invested $1 billion into this division of my company. It's losing money. The only way I'm going to make my money back is if I put another $1 billion into this division, instead of saying, could I put that $1 billion into something else? So the reason this is rare is teams usually don't have that happen. They make a draft pick. They pick someone in the top 5. And after a couple of years, instead of just going, oh, this player isn't very good, we actually have really favorable contract terms, because first round draft picks have the best contracts where you have 2 years of options. They're restricted free agency. There is nothing easier to walk away from than a draft bust, but teams are horrible at this. See, for example, that, Darko Milicic just was in the league for years. Kwame Brown in the league for years. The Candyman, who is probably regarded as one of the worst draft busts ever, years. And Adam Morrison, the only reason he wasn't around for years was because he got a major injury. So we noticed this. Teams have a sunk cost problem where they invest a bunch of money and time into someone, and instead of moving on, they keep investing time and money. And so that's why it's remarkable to see a team move on from, say, Josh Smith. Now, what people might say is, well, why didn't they try and trade him? Well, the thing people don't seem to realize, and that, if you're looking for some light reading, go read Larry Kuhn's CBA FAQ. And one of the things to note is trades are not very straightforward in the NBA. You basically have to get equal money in as money out. So you either have to take back bad contracts to trade off Josh Smith, or usually give up assets, things like draft picks or good young players. I think, for instance, the Nets were recently in talks to trade Deron Williams, who is pretty old. He's shown some goodness, but you probably want to shed that contract. But it looked like I believe it was the Kings, wanted Mason Plumlee as well. And so they basically said, no, we're not going to give up a good young asset to get rid of an old, overpriced asset. So with that in mind, it's really hard to give up players like Josh Smith unless you hurt yourself. And one of the funny things is we talk about the treadmill of mediocrity about draft picks. And what I will note is there is actually a really weird treadmill with bad contracts. You sign a player to a bad contract, you realize the player is bad. Instead of just moving on, you trade that player for other bad contracts, or you lose assets. And so now what you've basically got is, because you made a bad decision, that bad decision propagates into more bad decision. That just keeps going on. That treadmill of mediocrity is very real in the NBA. We can notice it happen all the time. So that's why it was really remarkable for the Pistons to just go, you know what we can do? Having no one, and this is true, would be better than Josh Smith on the team at this point. He is costing us wins. So we're going to move on. We're basically going to pretend we're paying a nobody player, I think somewhere around the neighborhood of 8 to 10 million a season for the next 4 or 5 years, and just move on. And we'll build around players like I think Greg Monroe, Andre Drummond, and hopefully be able to pick up some other good players. So in that regard, I'm actually really impressed by what the Pistons did here. And I should just stress it's rare. And just for anybody looking at Josh Smith, it's possible, right? If you pick up Josh Smith, it's possible that you can convince him to stop taking bad shots. It's possible you can convince him to come off the bench. It's possible you can pay him low amounts of money and have high upside. But frankly, if that's what you're looking for, if you're looking for a low cost, high upside player, there are many, many better options than Josh Smith. There are undrafted players in every draft the last couple of years you can probably get for cheap that have a much higher upside than a 30-year-old player who has just looked uncoachable for the last 5 seasons. So that's what I got on Josh Smith. Anything else to go on there, Brian?
Now, I don't have too much against that. I think the arguments against that is basically what you just said, right? That, well, there's not a lot to lose by bringing him in. We could just cut him right away. Like I remember, again, get back to the Warriors bias here. I remember during one of the Don Nelson seasons, I think one of the ones where they barely missed the playoffs a few years ago, they brought back Chris Webber after all these years. And they're like, maybe C-Web's got something left, right? He just didn't. He was too injured, unfortunately. But they gave it a try. It was low risk, and they cut him loose, right? So the argument of should they bring in someone else? Should they bring in, I want to say John Bryant? Is that Arturo's boy playing over in Europe? You know,
That was Patrick's, and that was a few years
Patrick's,
ago.
okay.
So I'm curious if
But
that's
guys
still the
like
case.
that is who you're talking about, right?
Well, I mean, so that to me, when people talk about low risk things like what you were saying, Chris Webber. Well, Chris Webber had been through multiple injuries. He was years removed. Of course, they were hoping for a Antonio McDyess kind of scenario, right? Where Antonio McDyess for the Spurs kind of had this resurgence, which was just incredible. But the problem with that to me is that those things are low risk but very low upside, right? In the best case scenario, you get Josh Smith having one good season, right? As a 30-year-old, and either he leaves you for more money, demands more money, or he's an over the hill 30-year-old who's not going to be great. Whereas if you try and find, a 22-year-old undervalued prospect and give them a chance, give one or two of them a shot, that seems to me to hold a much higher upside than Josh Smith. So that's why to me, when people are like, that's what distinguishes good franchises from bad franchises. People say, well, it's not a big risk. It's like, yeah, you're right. You can't screw up the draft. I think that's something just to be candid, right? There is no such thing, in my opinion, as a draft bust because the contracts you sign those players to are so ludicrously low and so ludicrously in favor of the team that you can just throw a dart at the board, pick someone random, give them a shot for 2,000 minutes, and if they're not good, cut them loose. It's the bust comes at that second part when the teams don't cut them loose. And so, true, right? That in that way you can never screw up the draft. But that doesn't mean you can't be smarter about how you draft. And it's the same thing here. True, there's not really much risk in picking up, Josh Smith off waivers for $500,000, $1 million. But if you've got $500,000 in a couple of minutes to throw around there, much higher upside things you can do. They probably won't pan out. That's one of the problems we have in professional sports is teams fear failure. You don't want to sign a player, play them for 500 minutes, have them be terrible, and then just release them and have people go, what were they doing? What were they thinking? Why didn't they sign Josh Smith, a proven commodity or whatever? But that doesn't mean that teams can't do it. So that's kind of my thoughts on the issue.
Yeah, and the biggest example of this that I can think of was Chris Kaman and the Mavericks. Now, I think all this stuff was like Twitter conversation, right? It wasn't, I don't know much of this.
It was conversation in the Wages of Wins comment section, and it made it to ESPN, which was very surreal.
Okay, so this is public stuff. But the way I remember the basic gist of this is that Cuban signed Mark Kaman and said,
Chris Kaman.
Sorry, Chris Kaman. What did I say?
You said Mark Kaman.
Anyway, I guess they're getting married now. Congratulations, Mark and Chris. So, but anyway, they no, it didn't go that far. He's just going to sign him to some small veteran contract, right? But and he said,
it was expensive, man. It was actually.
Was it?
So let me get the details up in front, but keep talking.
I'll keep talking. But basically, the end of this story is our guys criticized him for it, and he ended up replying to us.
This guy, Dre Alvarez. Okay. Dre Alvarez criticized him, not our guys. I was really hard against this.
All right, Dre specifically. We'll give you the credit or ignominy, whatever you whatever you
Well, what
want
I
to
want to
say.
say, what I want to say is like I don't want to divorce myself. I'm not. I'm going the opposite. I am not hiding
Okay.
behind what happened here. I'm taking full responsibility of saying I was arguing it vehemently against this. They signed. They what they did is they waived Sam Dallenberg and then signed Chris Kaman for 8 million a season. 1 year, true,
Yeah.
but no, just
And
no.
where this applies to what you were saying is that Cuban's defense against your accusations was basically our culture is so good, our system is so good, we can fit him into it and he'll become a productive player. And by the way, we do agree. I think all of us unanimously basically think that Cuban is kind of an NBA innovator in bringing in all these, treating the players well and da da da, having this culture. So we do agree with him there, but our argument against him was basically what you
That
just
is
said.
much. That is like argument there is like that part right there is much harder to do than everything else, right? Like
Yes.
if you're looking for bang for buck, right? Just signing a productive player versus trying to turn an unproductive player into a productive player. If you're talking like business 101, I think the classic model, right, is an existing customer is 10 times cheaper to retain than a new
Yeah.
customer, I believe is like the common thing everybody throws out. It's the same way in the NBA, right? Like spending $1 million on an already productive player versus spending $1 million on an unproductive player and trying to turn them into a productive player is just not as easy.
Yeah, if your culture is so good and it's going to bring all your players up, then start with someone who's better, and he'll be even better at the end, right? Because Kaman had never had a good season. And I hate to
He'd
say it,
been okay a
had
few
it.
years back. Okay, just okay. Not great, but okay.
Anyway, that's what this reminded me of. And Josh Smith has had better years than Chris Kaman, but still, I
Well,
good
that's the other
argument,
thing.
Dre. I agree.
Bob Voulgaris is one of my favorites, where he's like he hates the idea. So we'll see this like sports commentators, right? And I'm noticing this with Rajon Rondo. I'm forgetting. Do you know the last season Rajon Rondo had an All-Star berth?
Hey everybody, Dre here. This episode went pretty well. We've had a few technical difficulties on previous shows, but we did have a brief hiccup here where the wonderful world of Skype decided to kind of slow me down. Sounded like I was talking in a robot voice, which I think Brian references later. So all I was really saying here is that if you've got a player that's a former All-Star, former great, kind of calling him that is somewhat silly. I kind of compare to Rondo. I think you hear me do that again. And then wear and tear matters. So, age matters, and it doesn't matter if you used to be great. The issue is if you're older and beat up, it doesn't matter if you were great when you were younger, and I definitely compare Kobe Bryant and Josh Smith to this. So anyway, sorry about that, but you get to hear this fun behind-the-scenes look, and we'll get back to the show now.
In your body. If you're in your 40s, you're not going to be as good. It doesn't matter that you used to be an all-star. So that's kind of the point there with like Chris Kaman and Josh Smith. It's like, yeah, in the past, we've seen them play well. That's the past. Like we have to accept in sports that players age, and age and injury are two of the biggest detriments to players. And like, no matter how many feel-good stories you have, no matter how many Steve Nashes or Antonio McDyces you have, a majority of the players just wash out. All right. I guess that's all I got for you. Anything else on that, Brian?
No, we can close this segment out. There was a little bit of Skype trouble, but I think all your stuff got out, so I think we can move on.
I hope so. If not, I'll do the same director's
Just
commentary.
a little bit of robot voice, a little bit of Christmas robot. I like that.
Christmas robot. I like it.
Yeah.
All right. So when I say that's all, we've been talking, I think, for 30 minutes or something. And I got to rant against Kobe. I got to rant against Josh Smith. I got to rant against sports journalists. I got everything I wanted for Christmas. But, I guess to the internet, it's bah humbug. I'm ready to go to shout outs. And I forgot, we talked a little pre-show, but do you actually have any shout outs this week?
Yeah, I do have a shout out.
Oh, fantastic. What do we got?
No, my shout out, I haven't quite changed on the screen yet, but no, it's just to you and Patrick and Arturo, everyone else involved in the Boxcar Geeks, Wages of Wins, etc. Everyone you mentioned, Dr. Barry, Chris Ye, everybody, Ari, and of course all the fans and viewers and readers. It was a great year. It was a lot of fun. And I think we might do a show next week, so maybe, we'll have more chance to talk about that. But yeah, even if we're not winning the war of having the regular public accept stats, as we talked about earlier in this show, we still have a lot of fun doing it. So it was a good year.
So by the way, to let me even rant even more, I realize I'm not conveying this in quite the manner I want to, even though it was very ranty and very harsh. That's the key issue, what you just said there. We're not winning the war. The issue we actually have is it's not a war, right? What mainstream sports journalism wants to be is so far divergent from what like an advanced stats fan like myself wants that they're just not going to coincide as they currently exist ever, right? Unless there's a major change, they're just never going to coincide. And it's just kind of being
It's
at
just
peace with
different
that.
paradigms, right?
Thank you. Oh. We're gonna have to do the tech buzzword discussion at some point. But yeah,
Oh,
they
I was
are.
actually invoking Thomas Kuhn, the late great professor. Maybe I did that on a different show before, but yeah, a lot of paradigms involved
You know
here.
what's funny? I just saw we love ESPN 30 for 30. I just saw the playing for the mob one, and the main guy involved in that, his last name was Kuhn. He was the one
Oh,
that
that's
was,
right.
and it was the I forget the guy's name. I apologize, but the mobster in the movie Goodfellas is the mobster that was behind the betting scandal at Boston College. So
Yeah, in
remarkable.
fact, it's mentioned in the movie as they point out on the 30 for 30 episode. So that's an excellent one. I think we've talked about it briefly here on the show before, but yeah, great episode of 30 for 30.
Yeah, I don't think we've talked. I mean, we've talked a ton. And again, the last time we tried to talk 30 for 30, I think we ended up talking sports journalism again.
Yeah.
But no, they're great. If you've got a little bit of time off work, do yourself a favor. Go to Netflix, go to YouTube, go to ESPN. Just binge watch. Like, I think it is a close tie, I think, between them and bad reality TV cooking shows. It's one of my vices. ESPN 30 for 30, reality TV cooking shows. One of my favorites is Cutthroat Kitchen with Elton Brown. I can just have that in the background for hours and
It's
just
funny you
watch.
say that because our viewers have never pointed out the hypocrisy of we just bury ESPN 538 and Grantland constantly, but then we prop up 30 for 30, who's another ESPN program. But
Not do
it's
it
a great
right.
show.
Well, that's I mean, wow. Talk about, this is like reminding me of old times about failing to wind down, but it's the holidays. Let's view this as the Box Score Geeks Christmas party. So we're just relaxing around the water cooler, getting drunker and drunker. I'm not drinking anything, but pretend that's the way it's going. But, if you look at ESPN 30, the slight difference in a movie versus an article, right, is a movie is going to be edited before it goes out, and a movie has to be at least somewhat researched before it goes out. Yes, it's still going to tell a narrative, but that narrative is at least going to be somewhat fact checked, somewhat researched, somewhat polished before it goes out. And I think that interesting, I think you've pointed out, is I think ESPN, if it didn't have the onus of having to be out immediately, could produce some great, great stuff, all sports media in general. But it's that slight onus of saying, we need the narrative now. You can't think about the narrative. We need the narrative in 5 minutes, that I think prevents it from ever being what I want. Whereas ESPN 30 for 30, you just add a little lag. You say, do a little more research on this, and it can be really fascinating stuff.
And of course, the real answer is when I'm not joking, like I was before, is that they're a big, huge media conglomerate, Disney, right? And they want to give everyone everything. And due to technology, they can kind of do it now with the long tail content. So they can do all this mainstream stuff that we yell about. They can do the 30 for 30 that we love. And they can try to get, and by we, I mean the stats nerds, right? This one small little demographic. And then they can also try to give us 538, which sort of falls short, but we also kind of like. So that's really what it's all about, right? They're just giving us everything.
Yeah, I mean, and in fact, that's what I think you're summing it up. Let's end this on like a nice note. You're summing it up well, which is like it's unrealistic. I think it's acceptable. This is a much bigger topic. We could do an entire podcast. This. It is acceptable to criticize bad content, to say the story was bad, the research was bad, the writing was bad, etc. Right? It is fine to criticize it, but it is also acceptable. I don't think these two things are always at edge with each other, but sometimes they are. It is also acceptable to look at something for what it is and then not be mad at it, right? If I've got a 30-minute procedural show about a random sidekick and a police detective solving a murder, I'm not expecting the same story out of that as I'm expecting out of, say, a documentary about Helvetica
Or pro wrestling.
or pro wrestling. I mean,
Sorry,
that's
keep
one.
going.
That's perfect. No, I mean that's absolutely perfect. Pro wrestling, I have a really weird relationship with when I look at it, because it's like when you view pro wrestling through this lens of what it's trying to do, the traditions it's trying to uphold, you get a much different appreciation for it than when you're just a stupid person and I'll be candid, I'm talking about myself, right? When I say a stupid person, just looking at it as like, well, it's fake, it's scripted, it's whatever, right? It's like you have to go, what were they trying to do and did they succeed at that? And there's times, right? Like you can look at kids' television, you can look at action movies and go, what were they trying to do? And go, they didn't even succeed at that, right? This was supposed to be a popcorn action movie and it turned into Transformers. So that's all I'm saying there. And I think you're right. I think it's fine to go and just kind of just make the realization when I'm talking about this. I've spent years hoping ESPN and 538 was kind of like the last hope was going to turn into this content I wanted. And the kind of final thing I've looked at it is going, it's never going to be that content, and that's okay. That I can talk to the box score geeks. There are other I can watch ESPN 30 for 30. I don't need to look at that as a source for that content because doing so is unrealistic on my part.
Yeah, well said.
Yes. All right. So my shout outs after that long diatribe. First is it's Christmas. Abby Howard, who you may recognize from the Penny Arcade reality TV show, one of my favorite, Strip Search, one of the most hilarious people on the internet. I gave the links. Hopefully, you're getting it up on the show, Brian.
Yeah,
And
it's up right now.
make sure to scroll because it is a long one. But just I'll make sure to include a link.
I'll
to
scroll
those.
as you talk about it. So
I'm not. I'm just go read it. Give her the web traffic. It's hilarious. It's one of the most hilarious Christmas strips I've read. Maybe I just have a weird sense of humor, but I thought it was the funniest Christmas strip I've ever read. Go check it out. Follow Abby Howard on Twitter. She's amazing. Her stuff's amazing. Yep, that's my shout out there. Not quite sports. The other shout out is on last week's show to BPS. I had a typo on my graph, and in fact, it was a horrible typo because we talked about Draymond Green being bad at threes, and he wasn't. It was Dre making a typo in the graph that produced effective field goal percentage. And I actually said he was bad at threes. He's good at threes. So Draymond Green is actually just really weird in that he would follow the normal curve of good up close, good from three, but he's just amazing from mid range. So Draymond Green, I don't know what you're doing. You confused the heck out of me. Apologies on the 3-point error, and thanks so much for the fix. And by the way, as angry as we may seem at times to rude commenters or people that say stuff that I don't want to say disagree with, but I want to say stuff that we've had years of stuff we've written against, and we just don't want, we don't care if you're going to talk about rebounds. I don't want to hear it. Sorry. We are totally fine. Please correct the post. If you notice typos, if you notice stat mistakes, if you notice omitted information, I've made mistake. The salary cap is confusing. I've had times before where I've misquoted a salary cap rule because it was in year 2, not year 3. Please, please, please send those in. We really appreciate it. It makes the final product better. So BPS, thanks for that. Anybody else that does that, thanks. We really appreciate it. Have a happy holiday, and hopefully we'll see you before the new year.